Good afternoon. We are here today with Professor Rick van der Ploeg from the University of Oxford. And here we are with another interview of Free Thoughts on the Future. So thank you very much, Rick, for having accepted our invitation. And so we start with some questions as usual. So I start with the first one. Okay. So do you think it is possible to pursue the net zero emission target by 2050?
Yes, I think it's possible, but we really have to start taking actions. So there is the Green Deal for Europe. We have to price carbon much more.
Yeah.
So we have to kind of go up to about 200 euros per ton of CO2. That should be a path that grows at 2% per year in real terms up to 2050. That gives people the incentives to invest in green technology. Without that price signal, it won't work. And then there is, of course, the issue, not the minor issue, that we still need a negative emissions technology. That's not ready yet. It's not, and even if it's ready, it's not competitive yet. So some people think it may come on stream in 2040, it come on stream maybe 2030 if you're lucky. But we should invest in the negative emissions technology, and again, pricing carbon will help, because that will make it attractive to invest in negative emissions technology. So in all the runs for the IPCC, that's included, taking CO2 out of the air, putting it into the ground, but it's not clear that the technology is there yet. So that's something that's a big proviso. So you have to put all efforts into trying to get that there. Yes, so I think it's possible if we ramp up our actions.
Okay. About this, so which might be the main obstacles preventing the achievement of a target? What kind of obstacles do you consider predominant? For example, technological.
There are a number. So for starters, all the big oil, coal, and gas companies are still doing large billions of money into exploration. They're putting and then once they found an oil field or a gas field, then they're going to kind of explore it and invest in it again. So what we see is that reserves of oil, coal, and gas are growing every year, maybe 2% per year. Whereas we know that reserves of oil, coal, and gas, they should not be touched. They should go down to zero. We should no longer use oil, coal, and gas by the time it's 2050, unless it's offset by negative emissions. So what you see, the first obstacle is that the oil, coal, and gas industry, they have already lots of reserves on their books.
Yeah.
About 3.5 trillion tons of CO2. Whereas they're only allowed to burn about 400 or 500 tons if you want to stay below 1.5 degrees. So it's a bit more. They have a factor 7, 8, or 9 times as much oil, coal, and gas on their books. And if you would burn that, you would overshoot the target for Paris on the temperature cap by a factor 7 or 8 times. So the first obstacle is that there's a lot of oil, gas, and coal out there, and they're ready to use it. So Algeria, Nigeria, Mozambique, Russia, all the oil producing countries, they've got these reserves and they want to get on with it. And of course, so that's one obstacle. Another obstacle is if you price carbon and you'd only do it for Europe, then of course it's going to be a big problem that you price carbon. So by that, some of the carbon price is shifted to oil producers and gas producers. So the world oil and gas price will fall. So as a result of that, demand for energy outside Europe will increase, and therefore emissions outside Europe will increase. This phenomena leads to an offset of about 20%, and is called carbon leakage. So the way to solve that is basically to put a wall around Europe. It's called a CBAM. It's basically a border tax adjustment. And that basically you say, all those guys, you want to import and sell your stuff in Europe, fine. But then you first have to pay at the border, pay the CO2 tax to create a level playing field. Because otherwise it will be unfair. As soon as that happens, if we can solve that problem, if we can get rid of that obstacle that way, then we can get rid of all the free permits that we give to the biggest polluters in Europe. The biggest polluters in Europe, the steel companies, the cement companies, the horticultural industries in the Netherlands, the greenhouses there, they all get they don't pay the permit price. They get exemptions. So, but as soon as you have the border tax, and that will happen hopefully in 2026 that it starts operating, then we can take those free permits away, and then the price will be felt by the steel and metal and aluminium companies as well. And then we really can get our thing going. So that's an obstacle. We know how to overcome it, but we're working on that. Another obstacle, and I'll do one or two and then I'll stop, is just a political one. We've seen in Macron try to price carbon, and he got all the yellow vests on the street. Huge protests. We see that also in Europe, whether it's in Italy or whether it's the ultra right in Germany, the Netherlands. My father comes from. Populist parties are on the rise. Populist parties think climate policy is basically a toy for the elite. They say it goes against the ordinary man and woman. So they're very much against it. So that's an obstacle, a political obstacle. So you really have to think about when you price carbon, when you do a green transition, how we get normal people, ordinary people, low income people, that we can get support for them. So we need to use some of the revenue to give it back to low income people in the form of climate dividends so that they don't get worse off. Secondly, we have to make it, why are there those, it's a technological issue. Why can't they do it? Because they see rich people buying a Tesla car. They see rich people changing their house, getting rid of gas, putting on the heat pump. That costs about 50,000 euros per house. And poor people, they're trapped. They cannot do it. They just don't have the money, not even for roof insulation, don't have the money for an electrical car, and don't have the money to buy a heat pump in their house. So we need to think either cheap credit for ordinary people or more subsidies. And if you don't do it, it does indeed become the green transition. It becomes a toy for the elite rather than something that it's kind of supported by the whole of the population. So here I've given you some obstacles. The big oil and gas companies, the technological obstacles. How can you get everybody to move along with the technology? And then there's a final obstacle, which I haven't mentioned yet, is the behavioral obstacle.
Oh, yeah.
And that is because if you look at the temperature outside, and they tell you in England, they say it's 5 degrees outside, but it feels, because of the wind, it feels minus 10 degrees. It feels much colder than it actually is. If you do a green transition and you price carbon, the cost will fall mostly in poor people, and the perception of those costs for poor people is much higher than it actually is. It's highly salient. It's very salient. So that must mean that whatever you say, people just don't believe you. They see the carbon price go up, they see it immediately, and they say, look, it's hurting us. So you have to do something about these behavioral issues. So you have to really explain very well to lower income people, this is what we're going to do. If you go a bit green, you benefit. If you stay dirty, you don't benefit. Other people will benefit, but you won't lose out that much. So I think these are the main obstacles. They're political, technological, social, and that's it. There's one more obstacle, and that's that a lot of that green transition relies on subsidies and on governments, basically trying to pick winners, which they can't. You should leave it to entrepreneurs. The best way to stimulate the green transition is to do it in a technological neutral way. Let the market decide. But more generally, and I want to conclude with this question. Sorry for my long answer, but it's an important question. Is that the subsidies in the world economy for fossil fuel are 6 to 7%. 6 to 7% of the world economy, world GDP, are fossil fuel subsidy. That's many times more compared to the renewable energy subsidies. So the average price of carbon in the world economy is about $2 or $3 per ton of CO2. It should be 200. So it's very there's very little pricing. If anything, there are subsidies for polluting behavior. So we need to turn the whole system upside down. I can give you one final example, because I asked one final obstacle. There is a contract which many countries have signed up to, and that contract is called the International Energy Charter Treaty, and the Energy Treaty. And basically, it gives, from a judicial point of view, from a legal point of view, countries say that if we change the way of making energy from green to brown, you are hurt, so we must compensate you. So if you go green, you will get a lot of litigation. So you get, and then that means that there are going to be billions and billions of money to be paid to formerly brown companies. So the first thing is what we need to do is that many of these countries, Switzerland has already done it, but other countries that have not done it have to immediately walk away from that treaty, because it basically means that you've given all the rights of pollution to the polluters. So there you have a financial obstacle that before you do the green transition, you have to pay them off. And that's the weirdest thing ever, that many countries are still signed up to that treaty. So that was my very long answer. I promise that the next answers will be shorter.
No problem, because it's very important. So I think so obstacles, I understand that these are very important for understanding the obstacles. We can also be able to find which could be the solution, maybe, yeah. I don't know exactly. So the next question is exactly on this point. So looking at this, for example, carbon border adjustment mechanism could be a manner in order to try to figure out, you have mentioned this point, which could be a possible solution in this direction, because the obstacles are so complicated, and also solution, I think.
So given that I've given those obstacles, the solutions are now very clear. First, you announce a carbon tax from about 200 euros per ton CO2 today, and let it grow for the next 30 years in real terms at 2% per year. And you put it in the law, and you say, I'm going to stick to that. Secondly, you're going to introduce a border tax adjustment as soon as possible, implement it, and get rid of all the exemptions for the permits in the ETS. That's the second thing you do. Third, you really do a race for renewable energy subsidies, very much like we've done for COVID, for the vaccines. Then all the governments got together and we said, let's do a race for the first one to get COVID. Now we're going to do a race for the first one to get proper renewable energy technologies. And then combined with that, you scrap all subsidies for fossil fuel.
Okay.
And the last one I've mentioned is then, of course, then you must make sure that you compensate ordinary people, the poorest people in society. You can do that by giving them a climate dividend. You can give them subsidies for green technologies, electrical cars. You can give subsidies for if they scrap their dirty car, and that's basically, you might give cheap credit. So if they want to get an extra mortgage for their heat pump, give them a cheap credit for that. That's basically it.
Okay. So looking at the moment, we have spoken about climate change, problem related to environmental economics, and so on. Which are other issues other than climate change that would you prioritize for our future?
Yeah, okay. So I think this is a very important question. So I've now taken a narrow perspective. Now we have to broaden it out. We must realize that historically, all the emissions have been from the rich countries. Starting in mentions with Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution was driven by coal. If you burn coal, you get a lot of CO2. So that was the bad thing. And now we see that if we now look forward, global warming is rising in the next 30 years unless we do something. Almost all the costs will be borne by the poor countries, often in Africa, in South Asia, Latin America. Whereas the rich world, the global north, if you want, they may even benefit from global warming. In the UK, now you get better champagne than in France. So what you really have to worry about is ethics, the global ethics. So we really have to worry about what do we do with the developing countries. So the first thing we need to do is to make sure, I mean, we can't say you must become green. We must help them, because we must realize always when we talk to them, they get problems because we've been emitting so much in the past. So we must help. That's why this technology, green technology, is so crucially important. Just like the vaccines for COVID, we have to make that green technology available for free or very cheap to developing countries. So to make it possible for them to make the green transition. In actual fact, what will happen for some developing countries, that they'll move a stage. They go from a poor countries, miss out a stage of dirty fossil fuel industrialization, and go past that phase completely and go straight to green industrialization. So there may be a benefit, and that's in the interest of all of us. So another thing we need to think about is that's a less important. So the ethics, the global inequalities, a key problem. But there is, and then of course the problem is not just climate change. Closely related to climate change, there are at least three problems. There are many more, but I'll name three. Biodiversity. The worsening of climate and the worsening of biodiversity go hand in hand. Water. The depletion of our water levels, both in the rich world and the poorer world, is extraordinary. The amount of water in a beefsteak can be hundreds of liters, thousands of liters, and that's often taken away from the poorest countries. So we have to solve the attack on water levels as well. And thirdly, we have nitrogen. Over-intensive farming will lead to excessive nitrogen, and that will mean, of course, nitrogen is will help as a fertilizer. But you have too much of it, it will just kill the whole earth. So there are these three other issues to do with environment: biodiversity, water, nitrogen, and climate. These are all the four things we have to look at, and we have to look at a joint policy for that as well. So I've spoken about climate, but it's about it as well. And a very minor issue is perhaps that that one should realize that in dense countries like the Netherlands or the United Kingdom, that per joule of energy, per kilojoule of energy, you need more square meters to produce a kilojoule of solar or of wind energy than of oil or gas. So they take up more space for the same amount of energy. So that means that there is also it's not just the cost of it, it's also that there's a big claim on the landscape, unless you can go on the sea. So, and there's a big claim also for networks. We need networks to transport the solar and wind energy, and we need network to transport the hydrogen necessary to deal with intermittent energy. So those stuff, they require space, where space is very scarce. It competes with housing, it competes with offices, it competes with nature as a form of relaxation. So yes, so I think this ecological transition should be seen in a broader way, in the way I've just discussed.
Yeah, I think so. Everything is connected. So looking at also the idea of sustainability, and so it's okay. Among the many works that you have published, so the list is very, very long. So I take some books or articles titled. One book is titled "Climate Policy and Non-Renewable Resources" came out, and this book came out in 2014. It's very interesting, the subtitle, that is "The Green Paradox and Beyond." What is mean by the green paradox? Is it occurring and why?
So green paradox is basically, so let me tell you the story.
Yeah.
So I went to a Minister of Finance of Algeria.
Yeah.
And I explained how difficult it is, that we must do a green transition, and that it will come, because we've all signed up. We're all delaying it, but before 2050, we must do it. So at that point, carbon prices will go up, and nobody will demand your gas anymore. So I said, I said to him, you must have a plan B. You must use the gas revenues from the past, not for corruption, but for a green industrialization, to be sustainable from an economic point of view for the people of Algeria. So this finance minister looked at me in the eye, and he said, "But if I understood you very well, what you're really telling me," he says, "you're telling me that I should pump the gas up more quickly before they do the green policy, before they become serious about green policy." And that's exactly what the green paradox is. That people are anticipating that a green transition will happen, either because politicians start taking action, or because you get breakthrough green technologies. So green technologies that suddenly break through. Then suddenly the green transition, you get a tipping point, everything accelerates. And then all these gas companies and oil countries are stuck with it. So that's why they are exploring it more quickly. That's why the oil companies are investing in so much. They say, look, so far, there's no real, everybody talks about climate, but nobody's doing anything about it. So we're going to invest a lot in it still and try to sell it as quick as possible. And that's the green paradox, was by having a fickle climate policy, by not committing yourself to a long run path. What I said, that's what we should do. But having transition risk, then that will lead that people basically, they take the oil and the gas more quickly out of the ground. That will accelerate global warming, and that's called the green paradox.
Yeah, I think. No, it's very interesting, this point. Also, I think I combined also with another question. Maybe I don't know if they are linked together, but I think is another result that could be interesting. In one of your recent paper, I think is published on the Journal Economic Dynamics and Control. The title is "How Green Capital Slow Down Disinvestment of Carbon-Intensive Capital in the Green Transition."
So anyway, so this paper. So basically, this is a paper with two Chinese colleagues, and there the argument is that sometimes you need a brown economy, say the economy which is still carbon intensive, very simply, to just have enough economic means to finance the green transition. So you can't really dismantle the brown economy very, very fast. You should dismantle it as fast as possible, but maybe you can't go and do it overnight. Because you need, in a transition time for 5 or 10 years, you need the money, you need the ability because it takes time to build up the green sector. And then the mirror image of it is that it takes time to wind down the brown sector. And that's basically the argument, really. So it's basically that the disinvestment of carbon-intensive capital that should occur, but it shouldn't occur too fast either.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay, thank you. So I think also about some other papers that are published in the last period. So looking again on this paradox, also the other paradox, the situation in which maybe a paper of Acemoglu is on, for example, that extraction of a shale gas can also reduce the CO2 emissions, but at the same time can cause in the long run a reduction of investment in green technologies, and maybe in the long run could also reduce
Exactly. That's a very nice empirical example of exactly that phenomenon. That's a wonderful study. That's good indeed.
Okay, I think. So now I think about a book that was written by Robert Pindijk. That is last book of Robert Pindijk. That is the topic is again on the future of climate, but the book is also thinking about adaptation. So the next question is the fight against your opinion about mitigation versus adaptation. Should there be a perfect balance between the two, so we can move in one direction and also in the other one, so adaptation and mitigation, or we should prioritize one of them?
Okay, so in the old days, 10 years ago, I would have said, don't do anything on adaptation, focus on mitigation. Because if you say you're going to do adaptation, then people will lose their incentives to do mitigation. I think it's fair to say that global warming has gone so far that you already see these extreme weather events, you see floods, you see droughts, you see storms. So people need to protect themselves against it. One interesting example is Jakarta. So Jakarta is the capital of Indonesia. It's the second biggest city in the world after Tokyo. And it's a city which for hundreds of years has been flooded. So what do people do there? So they've moved some part of Jakarta to a new city for all the government buildings, but it still gets flooded. And now so what they decided, they're going to build the biggest wall in the sea, a big seawall all around Jakarta. It's the biggest investment project on the planet. And then think of the types. So that's adaptation, one form of adaptation. And then because you're saying let's protect ourselves again. And of course the Netherlands is like that. In the Netherlands we have all these dikes. Most of the Netherlands is underwater. Where I'm talking to from now, we are about 15 meters under the sea level. But we have these dikes. We have dikes, and we have this very clever way of managing the system. The Netherlands have always learned it. But then you have to invest in making the dikes wider and higher to keep on protecting against seawater things. And you have to have various dike rings and connect them up so that if one breaks through, that the other one doesn't break through. Anyway, so that's a form of adaptation which is very important. Now, I want to make a point before I say something else before. It's a complicated issue, is timing consistency. Because if I tell people don't live there because it's a risk of flooding, and then if that does comes up, and then if people do go and live there, they build houses there, then if they get flooded, and then you're going to help them as a government. But if I say in advance, don't live there because if there's a flood, I'm not going to help you, that's not credible. They're going to help them anyway. So then you get a very bad outcome that too many people live in floodplains, which is very costly, very ineffective. Another issue is this, that if property developers know a seawall is going to be built, then they will develop more property near the seawall. But if the government knows there's a lot of property going to be developed, they will build a seawall. So there's positive feedback there, and that means there are usually two equilibrium. So there's an equilibrium where we build a big seawall, a lot of protection, probably a bit too much adaptation. That's a result of a paper by Solomon Hsiang from Princeton University. Or there's another equilibrium where there's very little protection, everything gets flooded all the time. And both are bad, but you probably want to go to the one with more protection. Now, I can't leave you with the answer to this question without saying that there are many other forms of adaptation. Other forms, so you may build houses on stilts. You may migrate. Some people might migrate. You have crop that's not heat resistant, so we may develop heat resistant crops. So there are many things you can do. You can make houses stronger to resist the storms. So we mustn't think of adaptation just as a dike or as a seawall. It's much broader than that. Even international trade can be seen as a form of adaptation. So yes, so I think adaptation is going to be more and more important, and we should probably do a mix of them. This is of course particularly true for countries like the Netherlands, but even more true for the island economies, which are most. You have to make the decision. Are you going to let a piece of land go when the sea level rises, and you say goodbye to the land? You might even lose nations in the United Nations, that some islands are a nation and they may disappear. Or I say, no, we're going to stand for it, we're going to protect it. So just like we have a UNESCO World Heritage Committee, we need to have something much more important than that to decide what are we going to save and what are we going to give back to the sea. Because maybe it's better to give stuff back to the sea and build cities further inland on the hills. But these things are political transitions. Very few countries have started to think about it. But that's going to be the important question. Also true, maybe, yeah, particularly in countries where you have not much sea protection at the moment. So many places, they say this bit in Wales, where there's no sea protection at all. It's near the quarries, near the mines, and that's the first one to go. And yeah, and it probably will be let go because it's not important enough to protect it. But then you have to compensate these people who live there and give them a nice place to live somewhere else. Anyway, these are very tough decisions that will have to be made and are in nature purely political decisions. they're informed by economists, but in the end, they're political decisions.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and I move on to another book. So you have published a recent book in French. The title is Géoéconomie des minerais stratégiques dans les bassins du Congo. I think so, if the pronunciation is correct. In your book, you and your co-authors explain how the Congo Basin could build a dual ecosystem in which industry and technology would serve the 3S. Okay, 3S are economic security, territorial security, and personal security. According to my opinion, is an extremely interesting topic, and as the whole supply chain of critical materials, rare earth, in the context where there is an interesting decoupling between China and the US. So it's interesting about this topic.
Yeah, so more generally, I don't know the French version of this book, but the topic is very, very important. So in Europe, we have a war at the moment. Russia has invaded Ukraine. I thought I would never experience it, but we have. We've all become realists. Now everybody in Europe thinks we need to have a proper defense industry. But and then on top of it, we were also dependent on Russia for our energy. So Helmut Schröder, a former chancellor of Germany, was a big mover and shaker to get all these gas pipelines from Russia to Europe. Then we decided, because of the war, we don't want that gas anymore. So then we had a huge shift from gas from Russia to gas from America. Now it's not the same gas, now it's liquid LNG, it's liquefied gas. So that's the thing we've done. It's more pricey, but we've made that shift. Of course, we should have made a shift to wind energy or solar energy and become independent of Putin like that. So hopefully the LNG is temporary until we get the wind, the solar energy as well. Now, the big lesson from this thing, for this question is, what does this imply for critical materials? So if we then go to a White House report of a few years ago on the defense, by the Ministry of Defense, the Department of Defense, there's a huge chapter on critical materials. And that chapter on the critical materials, under Biden, concludes that 60 to 80% of all the critical materials necessary for the green transition are either in China or under control of China. So much of those areas where there are critical materials in China, in the world, like in Africa or whatever, are now already owned by China. So that means that if we do a green transition, we are dependent on China for those green materials, unless we get up our ass and get into action and try to work on our own supply of green critical materials. Nobody likes it because the critical materials, to mine them is very polluting, and nobody wants it in their backyard. So it is. So, but yet we have to think: where can we do them in Europe? In Iceland, Portugal, Poland. Where can we do it to be less dependent on the Americans? That's the first thing, because you can't do a green transition without these materials. The alternative is to really put a lot of investment in green technology, where you make the green energy not dependent on these critical materials, but on other materials that we have more abundantly available. There's some progress in that area as well. So although we're now seeing a trade wars now between China and the United States, other countries get involved. I remember there's a Dutch company called ASM Lithography. There are only two companies in the world, one in Holland and one in Taiwan, and they make all the wafer machines necessary to make microchips. So they're globally crucial companies, pivotal companies. And America has demanded from the Netherlands that they no longer export those machines to China. So we see decoupling, we see protectionism, and so we have to think that might have to imply things for critical materials as well. It's not only that we may not want to buy it from China, but China may refuse to export it to us in a full-out trade war. So this is something, it's an extremely important topic, because it touches security, economic security, it also touches territorial security. We know that most of the wars on the planet have been wars about natural resources. In that sense, critical materials are no different. And then of course, it will affect personal security as well.
Yeah. So again, remaining to this topic, so again more on European Union. So recently, Mario Draghi made some comments on the strategy of the European Union. That so the idea is in his speech, he is clearly underlined how the strategy of the United States and China are well defined. So, for example, something that you said in a couple of minutes ago. So, on the one hand, protectionism. So, US, on the other hand, the control of green technology and the resources from China, for example. And the role of Europe is in the middle, and the problem is I have to understand if the two policies by China and US can slow down or accelerate the transition, because it's, according to my opinion, is not so clear, so which is the direction, and the role of Europe. So according to my opinion, so there is a weakness about the political point of view, because we have so to cooperate better. So in some cases we have some problem. I would like to understand your point of view, or maybe this net zero emission, our policies could create as Europe as a front runner.
Yeah, so these are very, very important issues. So one thing we can say is that the Inflation Reduction Act under President Biden is really, of course, a huge industrial policy. It's a move away. It's really putting billions and billions of money on the table to green the American economy. It's not done by the price signal, it's by giving huge amount of subsidies. So it's kind of, whereas before we were always, from the point of view of the WTO, we were a bit suspicious of this industrial policy and those subsidies, like you protect your own companies, and then indeed you had to come, and so Frans Timmermans came with his green plan, a Green Deal, which contains many subsidies for the European green transition, also for the companies. So now you find governments giving huge amount of money for steel companies for them to go green. So the biggest, and also to Shell and to companies like that. So rather than putting the money there in the hands of the new companies, the new green ones, the old companies get helped to become green. So what you see is the French have always loved industrial policy. The Italians have a history of good industrial policy, the IRI, it used to be called, and I'm not sure whether you're too old to remember the IRI in Italy in the 1980s, 70s. And but of course Germany and the Netherlands are always against industrial policies, but they're changing. They're also becoming in favor of industrial policy. So you see two big blocs doing more and more industrial policy. As a result, what does that mean for trade? Because you think there's maybe unfair competition. We are now blocking China dumping electrical cars in Europe and the United States by putting up really the duties, sometimes maybe doubling the price. Well, then of course China will react, and they will maybe double the duty on the fashion products from Italy, or they might increase duties on Parmesan cheese or whatever. So then if the whole world goes into a trade war, into excessive protectionism, I think that's politically wrong, because that makes the world a less safe place. My mother always used to say, "Make love, not war." I try to live by that philosophy, but economists usually say, have trade and not war. Trade, not war. If you have international trade, so not protectionism, that's the best way to avoid war. We had in the CPR, one of our best economists was a man called Philippe Martin from Paris, the Sciences Po, who unfortunately passed away recently. And some of his best papers established this idea that the best way to avoid war is to have intensive, deep international trade relationships. So the fact that all these industrial policies, whether they're good or bad, so are they bad, are they good? Well, they're good because they may get something done for the green transition. Are they bad? Well, one, I think they're bloody costly. I think it's cheaper to use the price signal to use carbon pricing, but you're paying a huge amount of subsidies to get things done. Often that subsidy will be done in an inefficient way because governments don't have the information to put the money in the right place. And secondly, because of these big industrial policies, you get more protectionism, and more protection means that the world becomes a less safe place. So yes, it does perhaps some with the green transition, but it leads to more subsidies, more rent seeking, more protectionism, less security. So I would have preferred it if governments were incentivized, if industries were incentivized to become green, rather than being bribed to become green. Incentivized by having higher carbon taxes, rather than subsidized by bribing them by giving them subsidies. So that's my answer to your question.
Okay, so it's again looking at Europe. It seems that Europe reacts after some shocks. So we reacted after COVID-19. Now, after Ukraine war, we try to coordinate on military expenditure. So I don't know if, and in this case, the Green New Deal taken a big seat. So it's now it's in the second ranking, in the second place. I don't know if it's a good news. So on the one hand, we have Europe that is coordinating on something. So it's on resources. So after COVID-19, and now again thinking about military expenditure. Also because the idea of coordinating on military expenditure was one of the initial ideas European Union when started to coordinate 15 years ago, more or less, and were not able to find an agreement. But on the other hand, it's not a good idea. So to think about war, but it's better to think about environment. And my worry is that I'm a little bit worried about the fact that maybe the green transition could be in the second step, second place with respect to this one.
I can see your worries that because of the concern about the war, and particularly if Trump wins in the next election, then he has said that if you don't do your 2% of your GDP on defense, I'm not going to help you. So he's basically trying to make the NATO less effective. So Europe has to get used to the idea that they can't always rely on America to solve their defense problems. The war in former Yugoslavia was done by the Americans, was solved by the Americans. The war in Ukraine, the first countries to act were the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States, not Europe. They were slow. But it was their continent. That's for me, it's very, very embarrassing. So I think President Macron is correct in saying that Europe should work on a much stronger European defense force and have a budget for that, to have a credible defense on that. Of course, France has also nuclear, like the United Kingdom. So this thing would be Europe, and of course also the United Kingdom. So it would not be the European Union; it would be a proper European response. And that's clearly of vital importance. We need to make money available, and we need to do that because if we don't, the Russians, if they win in Ukraine, they will invade Poland, they will invade maybe Finland, they may invade Lithuania, and then really the costs are much more. So it may not be pleasant, but we've had a huge peace dividend since the Second World War. We've benefited from it, you and me, our generations. But this peace dividend, we've taken it for granted that it's for free. But it's not for free. You have to work on it. And unfortunately, current generation is more a problem for the current generation that we failed. We failed them. We should have built a more stronger military defense. And that's nothing to do with being left wing or right wing. It's just about developing your liberal and libertarian liberal values. Now, what does it mean for green? So when the war broke out, and when basically we decided we can't rely on Russian gas anymore, then I was reminded of the saying that every crisis, never waste a crisis, never waste a crisis. So I think we should have used those that thing to immediately move not from gas to LNG, but from gas to wind and sun. So we should do that more quickly. We should realize that the cost of a green transition are tiny compared with the damages you get to the economy if you don't do the green transition. So it's not, it's like bad economics not to do it. There's a recent paper out in Nature, came out a few weeks ago, and they said the cost of doing the green transition is 6 times less than the damages you get if you don't do anything. 6 times less. Another paper has just come out in the MBR working paper series, and they've looked at the damages from global warming, and they say compared with previous estimates by Nordhaus and by others, they're much, much higher, factor 5 to 10 higher. So really, it is foolish to think that you, like populists might make us believe, that we should go slow on the green transition to help the people. No, you make ordinary people, poorer incomes, in the end, much, much worse off. Because again, they will carry the biggest burden of global warming. Because global warming means, and then if you have people stay on in diesel cars, then you get more air pollution, you get more fine particles in the air, and that really always hurts the children of poor income groups more in Europe. And they will live 5-7 years shorter. So I think my concluding comment then is then on that is, yes, we should work very hard on the military expenditures to have a credible defense for Europe. The peace dividend can't be taken for granted. It clearly has been broken, the peace dividend, by the war in Ukraine. We can't assume that if the war ends and Russia gets given a part of Ukraine, that they won't do it again. They did it in 2014, they do it now, and they may do it in 10 years again. And also, we should do the green transition, because if we don't, things will be a lot worse. These may be somber messages, but there's always something, some things you need to deal with to avoid much worse. Good things about it is that we're getting richer all the time due to technological progress. Good thing is about it, we have now the big new wave technological process, driven by automation, by robots, by artificial intelligence, which I think will create a huge amount, will create its own challenges, but it will also mean that we all get richer, because we can do more things with less effort. And therefore, I think I'm actually quite hopeful about it, that we can actually easily finance the military expenditure and the Green Deal, the green transition, to find the money what's necessary with this growing economy. So in the end, I am quite optimistic, provided politicians take actions on these two fronts.
Okay, thank you very much. If I have 5 minutes, I have a last question, because I think about this, that is related to your idea about nuclear fission fusion for the future. I try to explain my idea at the moment, because previously you said that we could have some problem related to space, no? So when we use or we change, we choose substitute fossil fuel with renewable resources. We have to use also some new areas. So probably we need more areas in order to produce the same quantity of energy. So, and in my mind, I think that one point is why we are not using, or we. So when we said we, I think it goes about Italy. We have to think about nuclear energy for the future. Maybe could become important when we try to substitute all the fossil fuel, because we need a lot of new other added capacity. So I think if you substitute fossil fuel or electricity plant by with input from carbon gas or a little bit from oil, we need, I don't know, photovoltaic, wind plants, and also other type of plants. But we need a lot of land in order to cover, in order to produce this area, because we need the intensity, the energy intensity is lower with respect to the production by using fossil fuel. And so thinking about the future, we need to move to other types of energy. one idea could be maybe on nuclear. So I would like to think about your idea about this, if it's clear.
I think, of course, look at Germany. Germany, they were against nuclear energy and against fossil fuel. So they have to get out of it. It's almost impossible. They have to switch to wind and solar, but they're not allowed to use nuclear. So that's almost impossible. So in any normal mix, you'd like to have some nuclear. Now, the problem is this, that if you build new plants, by the time it gets onto stream, you're 10, 15, 20 years down the line. Secondly, they're extremely costly. Thirdly, you still have the issue of the waste products. So although I think in a mix, it's good to have a mix of green energies like wind and solar and others, algae, whatever. There may be some nuclear, but it's a fantasy to think that that'll come on stream in the next 2 or 3 years. And 15 years, that's too late. So it's, I think, part of a package in the long run, it could be. Of course, countries that already have nuclear, like France, they can just try to intensify that. The UK is building nuclear power industry, but then there's always the big issue, is it going to be built by the Chinese? Security issues again. So, and the Brits, it was a political thing because people like nuclear because, it's not so unequal, if you want, for poorer people. There's a big lobby for nuclear, but you must realize it takes a long time and it's more costly. So I think in a mix it's all right, but it wouldn't be on the top of my list. I'm not ideologically against it, but if you can do it relatively quickly and relatively cheaply, fine. But so far what I've seen, usually it takes 15, 20 years to get on stream. You may get unappetizing foreign partners. And thirdly, it may actually turn out to be very, very much more expensive. But still, those countries that have some nuclear, they may find a cheap way to be a bit more extensive. I'm not against importing nuclear if it's already there. That will be my answer. So yes, I think it's part of the deal, but I'd be hesitant. It's the same thing. Like, it's not as bad. Like another thing which is often mentioned is geoengineering.
Yeah.
So geoengineering I'm kind of against, because people say, geoengineering is cheap and we can just put up particles in the air like after a volcano, it gets cool. We don't have to do global warming. That's another one of those things. But then I think nuclear is more reasonable. But then geoengineering has a danger that we don't know anything about it. You have to keep on putting fine particles in the air, sulfur in the air, more and more and more, but the effect is temporary. Like the volcano, if it erupts, it's 1 or 2 years, it's a bit cooler, and then it's back to normal. So you have to keep on pushing more and more sulfur in the air. So I'm not sure that that's a pollution, but people get very popular about it. So coming back to your question on nuclear, I think it's a political thing, not an economic thing. So economically, I find it difficult to make a case, but politically, there may be a case for it. And indeed, some people make that case. And then that's fine.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rick. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for your time. We can now conclude here our interview for Free Thoughts on the Future.
It was nice to speak to you. It's a pity that I'm not there to shake your hand.
Thank you very much again. Thank you.
Okay. All the best. Have a lovely evening.
Okay. You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.